On March 30th, 1867, the United States bought 586,000 square miles of frozen wilderness for $7.2 million. That is 2 cents an acre. 2 cents. You cannot buy a gumball for 2 cents. The newspapers exploded with ridicule. They called it Seward's Folly. They called it Seward's Icebox. They called it Johnson's Polar Bear Garden. The editorial cartoons showed the Secretary of State dragging home a giant block of ice while the taxpayers wept. It was considered the worst deal in American history. A century later, that block of ice had produced billions of dollars in gold, billions more in oil, and had become one of the most strategically valuable pieces of territory on the planet. The Russians did not just sell land. They sold a gold mine, an oil field, and a military fortress, because they needed money to pay last month's bills. To understand why Russia sold Alaska, you have to understand the position the Russian Empire was in during the 1860s. Russia was hurting. The Crimean War, fought between 1853 and 1856, had been a disaster. Russia had gone to war against an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire over control of territories near the Black Sea. The war was brutal, poorly managed, and expensive. Russia lost. The defeat exposed the deep structural weaknesses of the Russian state. The military was outdated, the economy was stagnant, the treasury was drained. Tsar Alexander II inherited an empire that was broke and embarrassed. Alaska, which Russia called Russian America, had been a colonial possession since the early 1700s. Russian fur traders had established settlements along the coast to harvest the pelts of sea otters and seals, which were enormously valuable in the fur markets of China and Europe. But by the 1860s, the fur trade was dying. The sea otter population had been hunted nearly to extinction. The settlements were tiny, isolated, and expensive to supply. The entire Russian population of Alaska was fewer than 1,000 people, scattered across a handful of coastal trading posts. There were 2 towns of any significance. Sitka, the capital, had roughly 968 residents. St. Paul and the Pribilof Islands had 283. That was it. 1,000 Russians trying to hold a territory larger than most European countries. The real problem was military. After the Crimean War, the Russian government looked at Alaska on a map and saw a nightmare. The territory was on the wrong side of the planet. It was separated from Russia by the entire width of the Pacific Ocean, and it shared a border with British Canada. The British already had the Hudson's Bay Company operating in the region, leasing land in southern Alaska. If another war broke out between Russia and Britain, and in the 1860s that was a real possibility, Alaska would be indefensible. The Royal Navy could seize it in weeks. Russia would lose the territory and get nothing for it. So the Tsar made a calculation. If he was going to lose Alaska eventually, either to the British through conquest or to the Americans through the slow creep of settlement and commerce, he might as well sell it now and get some cash. And there was a strategic bonus. By selling Alaska to the United States, Russia would place American territory on Britain's western flank. This would create friction between the Americans and the British, and potentially weaken Russia's greatest rival. It was a move straight out of the geopolitical playbook. Sell a liability, pocket the cash. Annoy your enemy. Russia first approached the United States about selling Alaska in 1859. The Americans were interested, but the timing was terrible. The Civil War was about to tear the country apart. The negotiations were shelved. After the Union victory in 1865, the Russians tried again. This time, they found a willing partner in Secretary of State William Henry Seward. Seward was an expansionist. He believed deeply in the idea that the United States should stretch from sea to sea and beyond. He saw Alaska not as a frozen wasteland, but as a gateway to the Pacific, a gateway to trade with Asia, a gateway to resources that had not yet been discovered. He was thinking decades ahead while his critics were thinking about the next news cycle. The Russian ambassador in Washington, Edward de Stuckel, reopened negotiations in March 1867. Seward did not hesitate. The 2 men worked through the night, literally finalizing the treaty at 4 o'clock in the morning on March 30th. The price was set at $7.2 million. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $130 to $150 million in today's money for 586,000 square miles of territory. The math is almost absurd, 2 cents an acre. Manhattan today has land that sells for tens of thousands of dollars per square foot. Seward bought an area twice the size of Texas for less than the cost of a single Manhattan skyscraper. The treaty went to the Senate for ratification. It was not a smooth process. President Andrew Johnson was embroiled in the battles of Reconstruction. Seward had made enemies among the Republican establishment. Many senators saw the purchase as an expensive distraction. But Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, the powerful chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, investigated the territory and was persuaded by reports of its natural resources. He spoke in favor of the treaty for 3 hours. The Senate ratified it by a vote of 37 to 2. The formal transfer ceremony took place in Sitka on October 18, 1867. The Russian flag was lowered, the American flag was raised, artillery fired, and almost nobody in the United States cared. For the next 30 years, Alaska was treated as an afterthought. The federal government did not know what to do with it. It was governed at various times by the Army, the Navy, and the Treasury Department. There was no civil government. There were almost no American settlers. The territory was so neglected that at times there was effectively no government at all. The critics seemed vindicated. Seward had bought an icebox, and now it was sitting empty in the national basement collecting frost. Then, in 1896, gold was discovered in the Klondike region of Canada's Yukon Territory, just across the Alaskan border. The Klondike gold rush exploded. 100,000 prospectors stampeded north, most of them passing through Alaska to reach the gold fields. When ships arrived in Seattle and San Francisco carrying prospectors loaded with gold, the nation went mad. The value of gold brought back from the Klondike was estimated at over $1 billion in today's money, and Alaska was the gateway to all of it. The gold rush transformed Alaska overnight. Towns sprang up along the trails. Businesses boomed, and prospectors soon discovered that Alaska itself was full of gold. Major strikes were made in Nome in 1898 and near Fairbanks in 1902. Over the next decade, more than 50 gold mining camps were established across the territory. Suddenly, Seward's icebox was looking a lot warmer, but gold was only the beginning. Over the following decades, Alaska revealed itself to be one of the most resource-rich territories on Earth. Copper was discovered, coal was found, timber was harvested. The fishing industry, particularly salmon, became enormously profitable. Alaska's waters proved to be among the most productive fisheries in the world. Then came oil. In 1968, one of the largest oil deposits in North American history was discovered at Prudhoe Bay on Alaska's North Slope. The field contained an estimated 25 billion barrels of recoverable oil. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System was built in the 1970s to transport the oil 800 miles south to the port of Valdez. The pipeline cost $8 billion to build, making it one of the largest privately funded construction projects in history. At its peak, Prudhoe Bay was producing over 2 million barrels of oil per day. The revenues were so enormous that the state of Alaska created the Alaska Permanent Fund, a sovereign wealth fund that distributes annual dividends to every resident of the state. Alaskans get paid for living there. The strategic value of Alaska proved to be just as significant as its economic value. During World War II, Japan invaded the Aleutian Islands, making it the only part of the United States to be occupied by a foreign power during the war. The campaign to retake the islands was bloody and difficult, and it demonstrated that Alaska was not just a resource territory, but a military frontier. During the Cold War, Alaska became critical to American defense. It was the closest American territory to the Soviet Union. Missile warning systems, Air Force bases, and radar stations were built across the state. Alaska was the first line of defense against a Soviet nuclear strike. The total value of resources extracted from Alaska since 1867 is almost impossible to calculate precisely. Oil alone has generated hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. Gold, fisheries, timber, minerals, and tourism have added hundreds of billions more. The strategic military value is incalculable. All of this was purchased for $7.2 million, 2 cents an acre. The story of the Alaska Purchase is a story about how empires think and how they fail. Russia sold Alaska because it was thinking about the next war and the next budget crisis. It needed cash today and could not see the value of tomorrow. The United States bought Alaska because one man, William Seward, was thinking about the next century. He did not know about the gold. He did not know about the oil. He did not know about the strategic military value, but he understood that land is the one asset that never loses its value over time. He understood that a country that stops expanding stops growing. And he understood that when a desperate seller offers you 500,000 square miles for the price of a warship, you say yes and let your grandchildren figure out what to do with it. Russia got $7.2 million. It spent the money and forgot about Alaska. The United States got a state that has returned its purchase price thousands of times over. The Tsar sold a frozen wilderness because he was afraid of losing it to the British. Instead, he lost it to a man who stayed up until 4 in the morning because he knew a fire sale when he saw one. Seward's Folly was not a folly, it was a heist. And the receipt is still sitting in the National Archives, made out for 2 cents an acre, signed in the small hours of the morning by a man who understood that the best deals in history are the ones that everyone else thinks are stupid.